In the depths of winter 1912, in a studio that reeked of pine sap and something far worse, they found him. Silas Vane, the celebrated portraitist of Grief's Bend, sat rigid before his easel, brush still clutched in fingers that had turned the color of old amber. His skin gleamed with an unnatural sheen, glossy and hard as the varnish he had made famous. But it was his eyes that made the constable step back in horror, wide and glassy, frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The canvas before him showed a woman in black mourning dress, her pale hands folded, her dark eyes seeming to follow whoever dared to look. The painting was flawless, every detail rendered with the impossible lifelike quality that had made Vane's reputation. Yet something about those painted eyes suggested they had seen their subject's final moments and found them satisfying. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. The studio held 17 completed portraits, each more hauntingly beautiful than the last. But investigators would soon discover that beauty, in Silas Vane's world, had demanded a terrible price. This was not just murder, this was art that had fed on human souls for over a year, leaving behind masterpieces where living people should have been. Grief's Bend crouched in the shadow of ancient trees like a secret that refused to stay buried. The logging town existed at the mercy of the Grief's Bend Lumber Company, its 300 souls bound by sawdust, debt, and the peculiar curse of their surroundings. The weeping pines that crowded the valley earned their name from the amber sap that bled continuously from their bark, filling the air with a cloying sweetness that never quite masked the underlying rot. The trees themselves seemed diseased, their trunks blackened and twisted, their sap thick as honey but bitter as medicine. Local children were warned never to touch the weeping bark, for the sap would burn skin and, if ingested, could cause a paralysis that lasted hours or days. The lumber workers knew to wear gloves, to wash thoroughly after their shifts, to never let the amber tears of the forest linger on their flesh. At the eastern edge of town, where the mill's constant grinding gave way to forest silence, stood a converted barn that served as Silas Vane's studio. The building had once housed the company's overflow equipment, but Vane had transformed it into something approaching a cathedral of art. Tall windows faced north, letting in the pale, steady light that painters prized. Inside, the air hung thick with turpentine, linseed oil, and that ever-present sweetness from the surrounding trees. The townsfolk spoke of Vane's studio in hushed, reverent tones. They had watched him arrive 3 years earlier, a soft-spoken man with paint-stained fingers and an eye for capturing souls on canvas. His portraits possessed a quality that went beyond mere technical skill. Subjects seemed to live and breathe within their frames, their eyes holding depths that suggested secret knowledge. Their expressions caught at moments of profound revelation. What seemed like simple artistic genius, however, concealed something that would make even the hardened loggers of Grief's Bend question whether some prices were too terrible to pay. In a place where the very trees seemed to bleed, was it so strange that an artist could find a new way to preserve life itself within the confines of canvas and frame? Silas Vane had arrived in Grief's Bend during the autumn of 1909, stepping off the morning train with nothing but 2 traveling cases and a letter of introduction to the town's most powerful resident. Alistair Vance, owner of the lumber company that bore his family name, had commissioned a portrait through a mutual acquaintance in Seattle. What began as a simple business arrangement would evolve into something far more complex and ultimately far more deadly. Vane presented himself as a portraitist of modest reputation, trained in the classical traditions but drawn to the psychological depths that modern techniques could reveal. His initial work in town was conventional enough, Pleasant portraits of the lumber company's supervisors and their wives, executed with skill, but nothing approaching the supernatural quality that would later define his reputation. He rented the old equipment barn, converted it with his own hands, and began the slow process of building a clientele among Grief's Bend's small but prosperous middle class. Alistair Vance was everything the artist was not. Where Vane spoke softly and moved with careful deliberation, Vance commanded rooms with booming laughter and gestures that seemed to encompass entire forests. He had built his lumber empire through a combination of political cunning, physical intimidation, and an absolute certainty that the wilderness existed solely to feed human ambition. His hands were permanently stained with sawdust and bark, his voice permanently hoarse from shouting orders over the scream of industrial saws. Yet it was Vance's wife who would prove most crucial to the tragedy that followed. Alara Vance had arrived in Grief's Bend as a bride, 6 months before the artist's appearance, a refined woman from Portland whose education and sophistication seemed almost alien in the rough logging town. She possessed the kind of classical beauty that painters dreamed of capturing, with pale skin that seemed to glow in candlelight and dark eyes that suggested hidden depths of intelligence and will. The portrait Vane painted of Alistair became the first hint of the terrible gift that would soon consume him. The lumber baron's face on canvas held not just his physical likeness, but something deeper, a suggestion of the ruthless calculation behind his public joviality. Those who saw the painting remarked that it seemed to reveal truths about Alistair that they had sensed but never been able to articulate. The partnership between art and industry seemed fruitful indeed, until the industry's master suddenly vanished into the October mists of 1911. Before Alistair Vance's disappearance sent shockwaves through Grief's Bend's small society, there had been another death that few connected to the artist's growing reputation. Mary Hibbert, the 16-year-old daughter of the town's general store owner, had commissioned a portrait as a gift for her intended, a young man from the logging crew who planned to propose at Christmas. The girl was known for her vivacious spirit and robust health, qualities that Vane captured with remarkable skill in what would become his first truly extraordinary work. The portrait showed Mary in her Sunday best, but with an expression of such profound serenity that viewers found themselves studying her painted face for long moments, drawn into depths they could not quite understand. Her parents pronounced it the finest likeness they had ever seen, worth every penny of the substantial fee Vane had requested. 3 days after the portrait's completion, Mary collapsed while serving customers in her father's store. Doc Faraday, the town's only medical practitioner, arrived to find the girl in a state that defied his considerable experience. Her body had gone rigid, muscles locked in the same peaceful expression captured in her portrait. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her pulse weak but regular. Most disturbing of all, her skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that made her look more like a perfectly preserved doll than a living human being. The paralysis lasted 18 hours before Mary's breathing simply stopped. Doc Faraday could find no cause of death, no sign of poison or disease, nothing to explain why a healthy young woman had simply ceased to function. He listed the cause as wasting fever of unknown origin, but privately he harbored suspicions that he dared not voice in a town that had already embraced Silas Vane as their resident artistic genius. The townspeople explained Mary's death as they explained all misfortunes that struck their isolated community. The weeping pines, they said, sometimes released toxic vapors that could fell the strongest lumberjack. Pine fever had claimed victims before, though rarely one so young and previously healthy. The story satisfied most residents who preferred familiar explanations to uncomfortable questions about their celebrated portraitist. But Doc Faraday kept Mary's portrait in his medical bag, studying her painted face whenever doubt crept into his mind. There was something in those painted eyes, he thought, that suggested she had seen her own death approaching and found it beautiful beyond description. It was written off as tragedy, but in a town of hard truths, some were beginning to see a more terrible pattern emerging from the shadows of artistic genius. The disappearance of Alistair Vance in late October of 1911 transformed Grief's Bend from a town content with whispered suspicions into a community demanding answers. When 3 days passed without word from the lumber company's owner, his foremen organized search parties that combed the forests for any trace of their missing employer. They found nothing, not so much as a scrap of clothing or a disturbed patch of undergrowth to suggest where Alistair might have gone. Alara Vance played the role of distraught wife with convincing desperation, organizing search efforts and offering substantial rewards for information about her husband's whereabouts. But privately, she harbored suspicions that she kept carefully hidden behind her public grief. Alistair had spoken of visiting Silas Vane's studio on the night he vanished, mentioning plans to commission a second portrait, this one of his wife. When pressed for details, Vane claimed no such appointment had been made, that he had spent that evening alone with his paints and his thoughts. Using her considerable influence as the missing man's wife and heir, Alara petitioned the county sheriff for outside assistance in the investigation. The local constable, she argued, was too closely tied to the lumber company's interests to conduct an impartial inquiry. Her request was granted, and within a week, Constable Gideon Hull arrived from the neighboring county seat, carrying with him a reputation for thoroughness and an outsider's immunity to local politics. Hull was a lean, weathered man in his 40s who had built his career on the careful accumulation of evidence and the patient unraveling of small-town secrets. He understood that isolated communities like Grief's Bend often harbored truths that residents were reluctant to acknowledge, even to themselves. His investigation would need to penetrate layers of collective denial and self-interest if it hoped to discover what had really happened to Alistair Vance. Simultaneously with Hull's arrival, Alara made a decision that would prove fateful for both herself and the artist. She had begun to suspect of her husband's murder. She commissioned Silas Vane to paint her portrait, ostensibly as a memorial to her missing husband, but actually as a way to observe the painter's methods and gain access to his studio. The commission was substantial enough that Vane could not refuse without arousing suspicion, and prestigious enough to flatter his considerable ego. 2 investigations now converged on the painter's converted barn at the edge of Grief's Bend. One was official, conducted by a trained lawman armed with legal authority and investigative experience. The other was deeply personal, carried out by a woman whose sophistication masked a determination as implacable as the forest itself. Neither Hull nor Alara realized how dangerous their quarry had become, or how perfectly their separate pursuits would serve the artist's growing hunger for subjects who could truly appreciate the beauty of their final moments. To understand the horror that Silas Vane had unleashed upon Grief's Bend, one must first understand the chemistry of obsession and the terrible efficiency of the method he had discovered. The weeping pine sap that gave the local forest its name contained a complex mixture of organic compounds, including several alkaloids that affected the human nervous system in ways that legitimate medicine was only beginning to understand. Vane's breakthrough had come during his second winter in town, when a careless accident in his studio led to an unexpected revelation. While cleaning brushes contaminated with pine sap, he had mixed the amber substance with his usual varnish and accidentally inhaled the fumes. The resulting paralysis was temporary but complete, leaving him conscious and aware but unable to move for nearly 4 hours. During those hours, locked in his own body but able to observe every detail of his studio with supernatural clarity, he experienced what he would later describe as the most beautiful moment of his life. The refined varnish he developed over the following months combined the pine sap's paralytic properties with a fixative that could preserve not just paint and canvas, but organic tissue as well. Applied in the proper concentration, it could induce the same temporary paralysis he had experienced, but with a crucial difference. Where his accidental exposure had worn off, his perfected formula was designed to be permanent, creating a state of suspended animation that perfectly preserved his subjects' final expressions while slowly shutting down their vital functions. The process required careful timing and an intimate understanding of human psychology. Vane would begin each portrait conventionally, building trust and rapport with his subjects through several preliminary sessions. Only during the final sitting would he apply his special varnish, ostensibly to protect the finished work, but actually to seal his subject's fate. The paralysis would begin within minutes, creeping through the nervous system like a slow tide until movement became impossible, but consciousness remained intact. His subjects experienced their own deaths with perfect awareness, able to observe but not resist as their breathing grew shallow and their hearts gradually slowed. Vane painted furiously during these final hours, capturing expressions of profound realization as his victims understood the true nature of their situation. The resulting portraits possessed a quality that went beyond mere artistic skill, for they literally contained the essence of human souls at the moment of their passing. The beauty of the method lay in its apparent naturalness. Victims appeared to have died of sudden paralytic conditions, their bodies unmarked by violence, their expressions serene rather than terrified. In a community already familiar with the toxic effects of pine sap exposure, such deaths seemed unfortunate but explicable. It was the perfect silent crime, leaving behind not corpses but masterpieces. So who would ever think to look for murder in a gallery of artistic triumphs? If you're finding yourself drawn into the dark psychology of this case, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the disturbing truths that history tried to bury in unmarked graves and pristine canvases. Finn McReady had worked the lumber crews for 15 years, his massive frame and tireless strength earning respect among men who measured worth by the number of trees felled and logs hauled. But for all his physical courage, Finn harbored a deep, irrational fear of the weeping pines that he could never quite explain to his fellow workers. The trees seemed to watch him as he worked, their amber tears catching sunlight like malevolent eyes. On the night Alistair Vance disappeared, Finn had been returning late from a drinking session at Murphy's Tavern when he glimpsed a familiar figure walking toward the artist's studio. Even through the October mist, there was no mistaking Vance's distinctive silhouette or his characteristic confident stride. Finn watched from the shadows as the lumber baron approached the converted barn, knocked once, and was admitted by a figure that could only have been Silas Vane. What troubled Finn in the days that followed was not what he had seen, but what he had not seen. His route home took him past Vane's studio twice daily, and he had developed the habit of glancing toward the building's windows for signs of life. In the 3 days following Alistair's disappearance, he had observed lights burning at all hours and glimpsed the artist's silhouette, moving back and forth with unusual urgency, as if working against some terrible deadline. The guilt of his silence grew heavier as search parties combed the forests, and Alara Vance's grief became a public spectacle. Finn knew he possessed information that might help solve the mystery, but he also knew that his testimony could destroy the reputation of Grief's Bend's most celebrated resident. Moreover, he could not shake the feeling that approaching too closely to Vane's secrets might expose him to dangers he was not equipped to handle. When Constable Hull arrived to investigate, Finn initially avoided the lawman's inquiries, claiming no knowledge of Alistair's movements on the night in question. But the weight of his secret, combined with Hull's patient persistence, finally broke his resolve. In a dimly lit corner of Murphy's Tavern, with hands that shook despite their size and strength, Finn described what he had witnessed. Hull listened without interruption, taking careful notes in a leather-bound ledger that would later become crucial evidence. The constable's questions were precise and thorough, designed to establish not just what Finn had seen, but when he had seen it and under what conditions. The testimony, while circumstantial, provided the first concrete link between the missing lumber baron and the artist whose reputation had begun to seem increasingly sinister, with a witness placing the town's most powerful man at the artist's door on the night he vanished. The constable now had reason to look past the paintings and into the darker recesses of Silas Vane's creative process. Constable Hull's confrontation with Silas Vane began cordially enough. Two civilized men discussing art and tragedy over afternoon tea in the painter's studio. Hull complimented the portraits lining the walls, noting their extraordinary lifelike quality, while carefully observing Vane's reactions to specific questions about his subjects. The artist responded with practiced charm, discussing his techniques and inspirations while revealing nothing of substance about his relationship with the missing lumber baron. The veneer of politeness evaporated when Hull presented Finn McReady's testimony and requested permission to search the studio premises. Vane's objections were immediate and heated, citing artistic privacy and the sacred nature of creative spaces. But Hull had come prepared with legal authority, including a search warrant obtained from the county magistrate based on credible witness testimony placing a missing person at the location in question. The search itself was methodical and thorough, Hull examining every corner of the converted barn, while Vane watched with barely concealed hostility. The constable cataloged brushes and paints, canvases and easels, finding nothing immediately suspicious in the artist's tools and materials. The portraits themselves were examined with particular attention, Hull studying each painted face for clues about the circumstances of their creation. It was while examining Vane's desk that Hull made the discovery that would transform his investigation from missing person inquiry to potential murder case. Hidden beneath a stack of blank canvases, he found a leather-bound ledger that appeared to contain the artist's business records. The book listed each portrait commission with meticulous detail, including the subject's name, the dates of their sittings, and the fee received for the completed work. But it was the final column in each entry that caught Hull's attention and sent a chill down his spine. Every subject, from Mary Hibbert to Alistair Vance, was marked with the same single word written in Vane's distinctive handwriting. The word was completed, but something in the way it was written, with particular emphasis on the final letters, suggested a meaning that went far beyond the simple finishing of artistic work. Hull's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages, cross-referencing names and dates with his own notes about disappearances and unexplained deaths in Grief's Bend. The pattern that emerged was impossible to ignore and terrifying to contemplate. Every person listed in Vane's ledger had either died or vanished within days of their portrait's completion, their fates explained away by the community as accidents, illnesses, or simple departures for distant places. The ledger contained no confession of murder, but its systematic documentation of victims created a paper trail that would have made a military quartermaster proud. It represented a colder, more bureaucratic kind of dread than any blood-stained weapon or shallow grave could have provided. Doc Faraday arrived at Vane's studio within an hour of Hull's urgent summons, his medical bag in hand and his skeptical mind prepared to examine whatever evidence the constable had uncovered. The two men spread the leather-bound ledger across Vane's own painting table, its pages illuminated by the same north-facing windows that had lit so many final portraits. The entries began innocuously enough, with conventional portraits of lumber company supervisors and their families. Each commission was recorded with professional precision: the subject's name, the number of sittings required, the materials used, and the fee collected. But as the months progressed, the ledger revealed a disturbing evolution in both Vane's clientele and his methods. Mary Hibbert's entry was the first to show the ominous pattern that would define all subsequent commissions. Her name appeared in early summer of 1911, followed by 4 sitting dates spread across 3 weeks. The final column, where Vane recorded the portrait's completion, was dated exactly 2 days before her mysterious paralytic death. The word "completed" was written with particular care, its letters slightly larger and darker than the surrounding text. Doc Faraday produced his own records, cross-referencing dates of death with the ledger's completion dates. The correlation was perfect and terrifying. Every subject listed in Vane's book had died or disappeared within 72 hours of their portrait's completion. The causes of death varied from Mary's unexplained paralysis to several cases of sudden heart failure, but the timing was consistent enough to eliminate any possibility of coincidence. Alistair Vance's entry appeared near the ledger's end, dated October 28th of 1911. Unlike the other subjects, his record showed only a single sitting date, the night Finn McReady had witnessed him entering the artist's studio. The completed notation was dated the following morning, written in the same careful script, but with an addition that made Hull's blood run cold. Below the word "completed," Vane had added a single line: "Most satisfactory expression achieved." The final entry in the ledger was the most chilling of all. Alara Vance's name appeared at the bottom of the page, with a commission date from the previous week and a series of sitting appointments scheduled for the coming days. The completion column remained blank, but the space had been carefully prepared, as if Vane was merely waiting for the proper moment to add his characteristic notation. Hull and Doc Faraday exchanged glances across the damning evidence spread before them. The ledger represented more than circumstantial evidence. It was a systematic record of serial murder disguised as artistic achievement. But before they could confront Vane with their discovery, they heard the sound of carriage wheels on gravel and looked up to see Alara Vance herself arriving for what the ledger suggested would be her final sitting. The evidence was circumstantial, but the pattern was undeniable. Yet before Hull could make an arrest, Alara Vance entered the studio for her final sitting, unaware that she was walking into a trap more than a year in the making. Alara Vance entered the studio with the composed dignity that had characterized her public appearances since her husband's disappearance, her black mourning dress rustling softly against the paint-splattered floorboards. She carried herself with the bearing of a woman accustomed to command, but Vane detected something new in her demeanor, a watchfulness that suggested she had come prepared for more than a simple portrait sitting. The artist had dismissed Constable Hull and Doc Faraday earlier, claiming the need for privacy during his creative process. He now regretted that decision, for he sensed in Alara's steady gaze the kind of dangerous intelligence that his previous subjects had lacked. Where Mary Hibbert had been trusting and Alistair commanding but careless, Alara possessed a calculating awareness that made her far more formidable prey. She positioned herself in the chair he had prepared, adjusting her pose with practiced grace while studying the portraits that lined the studio walls. Her gaze lingered particularly long on her husband's completed portrait, noting details that others had overlooked. Alistair's painted expression showed not the confidence he had projected in life, but something approaching terror. As if he had realized his fate in the final moments before the paralytic varnish took effect. Vane began the session conventionally, mixing his paints and preparing his brushes while engaging in the sort of pleasant conversation that helped his subjects relax. But Alara's responses were different from those of his previous victims, sharp and probing rather than merely polite. She asked detailed questions about his techniques, particularly his use of varnishes and fixatives, displaying a knowledge of chemistry that surprised and unsettled him. It was when Vane reached for his special varnish, the amber-tinted mixture that would seal both the portrait and his subject's fate, that Alara made her move. She produced a small object from her reticule, holding it up to catch the studio's pale light. It was a cufflink, gold and monogrammed with Alistair's initials, but stained with the unmistakable amber residue of weeping pine sap. She had found it, she explained calmly, in her husband's study after his disappearance, carefully cleaned and placed where she would be certain to discover it. The sap stains told a story that Alistair's carefully maintained public persona had never suggested. Her husband had not died in the forests or fled to distant cities, but had met his end in this very studio, poisoned by the same artistic process that had claimed Mary Hibbert and others, whose names she was only beginning to learn. Vane's hand froze above his varnish pot as Alara continued speaking, her voice never losing its conversational tone despite the accusations she was making. She had not come to be painted, she revealed, but to see justice done for crimes that the law might never be able to prove. She had studied her husband's chemical notes from his lumber processing experiments, learning about compounds and reactions that could turn artistic materials into instruments of death. The trap Vane had prepared for his final subject had become a trap for himself, sprung by a woman whose sophistication masked a determination as implacable as the forest itself. In his obsession with capturing the perfect expression of realized doom, Vane had failed to see that his latest subject had not come to be preserved, but to become the artist of his own carefully planned demise. The revelation of Alara's true purpose transformed the studio from gallery to courtroom, with the artist finding himself judged by a jury of one whose verdict had been decided long before the trial began. Vane's carefully maintained composure finally cracked as he realized that he was no longer the hunter but the hunted, that his own methods were being turned against him with surgical precision. Alara's investigation had been far more thorough than Constable Hull's official inquiry, conducted with the advantages of intimate knowledge and unlimited access to her husband's personal effects. She had discovered Alistair's correspondence with lumber industry chemists, his experiments with pine sap processing, and most damning of all, his notes about Silas Vane's unusual requests for specific chemical compounds that had no legitimate artistic application. Her husband had not been Vane's victim, she revealed, but his unwilling collaborator. Alistair had provided the artist with purified pine sap extracts, believing them intended for an innovative varnish formula that could revolutionize portrait preservation. Only when he had begun to connect his chemical supplies with the mysterious deaths in Grief's Bend had he realized the true nature of his contribution to Vane's artistic process. The confrontation between husband and artist had occurred not in Vane's studio, as Finn McReady had witnessed, but in Alistair's private office at the lumber mill. Alistair had threatened to expose Vane's crimes unless the artist ceased his murderous activities and submitted to legal authorities. But Vane had come prepared for such an ultimatum, carrying with him a concentrated dose of his paralytic varnish disguised as a peace offering of expensive wine. Alistair's death had been swift but conscious, his powerful body succumbing to the neural toxins while his mind remained aware of every detail. Vane had transported the body to his studio in the dead of night, posing it before his easel and painting frantically to capture the lumber baron's final expression of betrayed horror. The completed portrait had then been carefully aged and weathered to suggest it had been painted weeks earlier, providing Vane with an alibi for the time of death. But Alara had been preparing her own artistic masterpiece, a work of justice that would rival anything in Vane's ghastly gallery. She had substituted his usual varnish with her own creation, a formula based on her husband's industrial adhesive research that combined the paralytic properties of pine sap with compounds that would create an irreversible chemical bond. Where Vane's varnish had preserved his victim's final moments, Alara's mixture would preserve the artist himself, creating a living sculpture that would serve as both confession and punishment. The painter of Grief's Bend had not met his match in a constable or a mob of outraged townspeople, but in a masterpiece of revenge painted with his own brutal brush and sealed with the very chemistry he had perverted into an instrument of murder. The discovery of Silas Vane's body on January 12th of 1912 sent shockwaves through Grief's Bend that reverberated far beyond the town's isolated borders. Constable Hull, summoned by Mrs. Hibbert's hysterical screams, found the artist posed before his easel in a grotesque parody of creative inspiration. The paralytic varnish had done its work with terrible efficiency, transforming Vane into a living sculpture that preserved his final expression of absolute terror. Doc Faraday's examination revealed the true horror of the artist's condition. The varnish had not merely paralyzed Vane, but had begun a chemical bonding process that fused his tissue with the canvas he had been painting. His final work, a portrait of Alara Vance, showed the subject not as a grieving widow, but as an avenging angel, her painted eyes holding a satisfaction that seemed almost alive in the studio's dim light. The official inquest, conducted by the county coroner with assistance from chemical experts brought in from Portland, concluded that Vane had died as a result of accidental exposure to his own toxic varnish formulation. The artist's history of working with dangerous chemicals from the local pine sap, combined with evidence of increasingly reckless experimentation, provided a plausible explanation for what appeared to be a laboratory accident gone catastrophically wrong. Hull privately disagreed with the official verdict, but lacked sufficient evidence to challenge it in court. His investigation had uncovered the damning ledger and established a clear pattern of suspicious deaths, but proving premeditated murder required more than circumstantial evidence and coincidental timing. The chemical analysis of Vane's final varnish batch showed compounds not present in his earlier work, suggesting outside interference, but the source of these additions remained untraceable. Alara Vance had vanished from Grief's Bend within hours of Vane's death, departing on the early morning train with a single traveling case and a substantial inheritance from her husband's lumber empire. She left behind a letter for Hull, explaining her decision to leave a town that held too many painful memories but offering no insight into her possible knowledge of the artist's demise. Her destination remained unknown, though rumors occasionally surfaced of a mysterious woman patron supporting artists in distant cities. The studio was sealed by county authorities and eventually boarded up, its collection of portraits deemed too disturbing for public display. The building remained empty for decades, becoming a source of local folklore and occasional pilgrimage site for those drawn to its dark history. With the official record closed and its principal figures dead or vanished, the story was free to warp and grow in the dark soil of local gossip and regional legend. The legend of Silas Vane has proven remarkably persistent, drawing investigators and curiosity seekers to Grief's Bend long after the original events faded from living memory. The sealed studio has become a kind of dark shrine, its boarded windows and weathered walls attracting amateur historians, paranormal investigators, and artists seeking inspiration from the macabre circumstances of their predecessors' demise. Local residents report that the building sometimes emanates the distinctive scent of pine sap and turpentine on still nights, as if the artist's final chemical experiment continues to react decades after his death. More disturbing are the accounts of visitors who claim to have glimpsed movement through cracks in the boarded windows, shadows that suggest someone still works at an easel in the studio's perpetual darkness. Modern art historians have attempted to authenticate Vane's surviving portraits, studying the unusual properties of his varnish formulations and the extraordinary lifelike qualities of his subjects' expressions. Chemical analysis has confirmed the presence of organic compounds derived from local pine species, but has failed to explain the preservation techniques that keep the paintings as vivid today as they were when first completed over a century ago. The most persistent legend surrounds Vane's final portrait of Ilara Vance, which reportedly remains in the sealed studio exactly as it was found on the day of his death. Visitors who have managed to peer through gaps in the boarding claim that the painted woman's eyes appear to track movement, and that on certain anniversaries of Vane's death, amber-colored tears seep from the portrait's surface to pool on the studio floor. These accounts, while dismissed by skeptics as products of suggestion and local mythology, have attracted researchers from universities and paranormal investigation groups across the Pacific Northwest. Each team arrives convinced that scientific methodology can separate fact from folklore, but few emerge with explanations that satisfy either themselves or their academic peers. The town of Grief's Bend itself has largely been abandoned, the lumber company having exhausted the commercially viable timber decades ago. The weeping pines still stand, their amber sap still bleeding down scarred bark, but their toxic tears now fall on empty ground. Only the artist's studio remains as testament to the horrors that once flourished in the shadow of those diseased trees. The legend insists that the painting isn't finished, that it's still waiting for its final subject to return and complete the work that death interrupted. In the end, whether by curse or chemistry, Silas Vane achieved the goal that had driven him to murder and ultimately to his own destruction. He became one with his art, a permanent monument to the beauty and terror of his own obsession. His final portrait stands not in a gallery or private collection, but in a sealed studio where it serves as both masterpiece and memorial, confession and punishment rendered in oil and varnish and human tissue. The truth of what happened in that converted barn during the winter of 1912 may never be fully known, but the physical evidence speaks with brutal clarity. Vane discovered that the pursuit of perfect beauty could justify any sacrifice, including the sacrifice of human life itself. His victims became unwilling collaborators in artistic works that captured not just their physical likeness, but the essence of their final moments, their souls sealed forever within layers of toxic varnish. Yet the artist's ultimate masterpiece was not any of the portraits that line his studio walls, but his own transformation from hunter to hunted, from creator to creation. In seeking to preserve others' final moments of realized terror, he created the conditions for his own permanent entombment in a medium of his own devising. The paralytic varnish that had been his instrument of murder became his final canvas, preserving his horror for whatever eyes might eventually witness it. The moral of Silas Vane's story extends beyond the specific circumstances of his crimes to touch on fundamental questions about the relationship between art and humanity, between creation and destruction, between the pursuit of beauty and the preservation of life. His tale serves as a reminder that obsession, no matter how refined or intellectualized, ultimately creates a prison of one's own design. The studio in Grief's Bend remains sealed, its contents slowly aging in perpetual twilight. But the questions it raises about the nature of artistic inspiration and the price of aesthetic perfection continue to haunt those who hear its story. Some say you can still smell the weeping pines in that locked room where a final varnish continues drying on a canvas that can never truly be completed. If stories like this fascinate you as much as they disturb you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the truths that history tried to varnish over with pretty lies and official explanations. The weeping pines still stand in the abandoned valley that once housed Grief's Bend, their diseased trunks continuing to bleed, amber tears that no living eyes now witness. The lumber mill has crumbled to rust and rotting timber. The company houses have surrendered to vine and weather, but the trees endure as they have for centuries, indifferent to human ambition and human suffering alike. Occasionally, hikers following old logging roads stumble across the ghost town's remains, drawn by curiosity about the settlement that maps show but satellite images reveal as nothing more than clearings overgrown with second-growth forest. Most pass through quickly, disturbed by an atmosphere of decay that seems to emanate from the very soil. But some are drawn to the sealed building that stands apart from the other ruins, its boarded windows and reinforced doors suggesting secrets worth protecting. Those who manage to peer through gaps in the boarding report, seeing exactly what investigators found over a century ago. An easel stands before a north-facing window, supporting a canvas that shows a woman in black mourning dress. Before the easel sits a figure that might once have been human, now transformed into something resembling a sculpture carved from amber and horror. The scene appears unchanged by decades of neglect, preserved by chemical processes that continue to defy scientific explanation. The painting itself remains the most disturbing element of the tableau. Alara Vance's portrait shows not the grieving widow she appeared to be in life, but something approaching divine retribution, her painted eyes holding depths of satisfaction that seem to acknowledge viewers' presence. On certain days when light strikes the canvas at particular angles, witnesses swear they can see movement in those painted depths, as if the subject's consciousness remains trapped within the pigment and varnish that define her eternal form. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the sealed studio is what it represents, about the persistence of human obsession and the ultimate futility of attempting to preserve beauty through the destruction of life. Silas Vane sought to capture the perfect expression of human realization at the moment of death, but succeeded only in creating a monument to his own moral collapse. His victims' portraits may possess an uncanny lifelike quality, but they represent not artistic triumph, but the complete failure of the artistic impulse to elevate rather than diminish human experience. The forest remembers what the town has forgotten, and what the official records have obscured. In the end, beauty achieved through murder is not beauty at all, but a grotesque perversion that transforms both creator and creation into something less than human. The painter of Grief's Bend achieved immortality, but it is the immortality of the cautionary tale, the permanent reminder that some prices are too terrible to pay for any earthly reward. The varnish continues to dry, the portrait continues to watch, and the weeping pines continue to bleed their amber tears over a story that refuses to end.